The radius is the lateral bone of the forearm and is homologous with the tibia of the lower limb. Of the two bones of the forearm, radius is the one that pivots around a point to provide movement. Now talking about the radius, it is prism-shaped and slightly curved longitudinally. It is slightly thicker and shorter than the ulna. Just so you don't confuse the two bones of the forearm since they are parallel to each other, you can remember it as radius is right on the right arm. It extends from the lateral side of the elbow to the thumb side of the wrist. The radius rotates around the ulna, and at the other end, it rotates around the wrist. So it pivots around these points. The radius is also known as the bod bone, working in a robotic manner and causing the respective movement. Something to note here is that the ulna acts as the center point of this circle, so the ulna does not move at all. It merely provides support, but the radius is responsible for the main movement of the arm. As you can see here, during the pronation and supination of the forearm, the bone that moves is the radius, whereas the ulna is stable at a point. It has an upper rounded end, also called the proximal end, a lower broad end, or the distal end with a styloid process, and the middle part, the shaft. We will start by talking about the upper, or the proximal end first. The proximal part is the first part of the bod bone that participates in elbow joint formation. It is situated right beside the ulna and beneath the humerus. This proximal radius consists of three main portions: radial head, neck, tuberosity. Let's have a look at these landmarks. The radial head is cylindrical, as you can see. On its upper surface, there is a small dip or fova. It spreads medially and becomes narrow as we move down. The annular or orbicular ligament is wrapped around this narrow portion. This head rotates within this annular ligament to produce supination and pronation movement of the forearm. The head articulates at 2 points. One is at the capitulum of the humerus, and the other at the radial notch of the ulna. The capitulum of the humerus articulates with the dip on top of the radial head, forming the elbow joint, whereas the proximal radiulnar joint is formed by the articulation between the broad medial portion of the head and the radial notch of the ulna. So basically, the radial bone is articulated both with the humerus and ulna via the head of the proximal end. As for the neck of the radius, it is a narrow area of bone, which lies between the radial head and outspread tuberosity. Clinically, it is important as most fractures of the radius occur at the neck. Radial tuberosity, as shown here, is a bony projection, which provides the attachment site of the biceps brachii muscle. As for the radial shaft, the radial shaft expands in diameter as it moves distally. It is thickest where it meets the interosseous membrane. This is one of the distinguishing points of identifying the radius from the ulna. Much like the ulnar bone, it is triangular in shape, with 3 borders and 3 surfaces. Let's talk about the borders first. It has 3 borders. The first one is the volar border, or the anterior border. It extends from the lower part of the tuberosity above to the foremost aspect of the base of the styloid process below, and isolates the volar from the lateral surface. Its upper third is prominent and from an oblique line. The dorsal border or posterior border starts above the rear of the neck and ends below at the posterior part of the base of the styloid process. It is most visible in the midsection of the shaft. It separates the posterior surface from the lateral surface. The interosseous border or crest begins above, the back part of the tuberosity. Its upper part is rounded and indistinct, then it becomes sharp and prominent as we move down. This crest separates the volar from the dorsal surface and then gives attachment to the interosseous membrane. The association between the two bones, that is radius and ulna, is really a joint alluded to as a syndesmosis joint. Now, if we look at the surfaces of the radius bone, just like borders, it has three surfaces: volar, dorsal, and the lateral surface. The volar surface is concave in its upper 3/4, and here flexor pollicis longus muscle originates. It is broad and flat in its lower fourth and manages addition to the pronator quadratus. At the junction of the upper and middle thirds of the volar surface is the nutrient foramen. It is directed obliquely upward. The dorsal surface is convex, smooth in the upper third of its extent, and covered by the supinator. Its middle third is broad, concave, and gives rise to the abductor pollicis longus cranially and the extensor pollicis brevis muscle caudally. The lower third is broad, convex, and covered by the tendons of the muscles, which subsequently run in the grooves on the lower end of the bone. The last surface is the lateral surface, or external surface, which is convex throughout its entire extent and is known as the convexity of the radius. The upper third of this surface gives insertion to the supinator muscle. About its middle is a rough ridge for the insertion of another muscle, pronator teres muscle. Its lower part is narrow and covered by the tendons of the abductor pollicis longus muscle and extensor pollicis brevis muscle. Now let's talk about the distal end of the radius. In the distal region, the radial shaft expands to form a rectangular end. The lateral side extends to form the styloid process. The medial side consists of a concave ulnar notch, articulated with the ulnar head in pronation, forming the distal radiulnar joint. The lower end is the widest part of the bone. It has 5 surfaces. The interior surface is in the form of a thick, prominent ridge. The radial artery is palpated against this surface. The posterior surface presents 4 grooves for the extensor tendons. The dorsal tubercle of Lister lies lateral to an oblique groove. It is an important landmark in dorsal wrist capsulotomy. As mentioned before, the medial surface is occupied by the ulnar notch for the head of the ulna. The lateral surface is prolonged downwards to form the styloid. As for the inferior surface, it bears a triangular area for the scaphoid bone and a medial quadrangular area for the lunate bone. This surface takes part in forming the wrist joint. Let's now move to the muscles attachment and insertion on the radius bone. Proximal radius. On the proximal end, biceps brachii attaches to the radial tuberosity. Upper shaft, supinator, flexor pollicis longus, and the flexor digitorum superficialis attach to the upper third part of the shaft of the radius. Midshaft. We have extensor pollicis brevis muscle, abductor pollicis longus muscle, and pronator teres muscles all attached to the midshaft of the radius. Distal part of radius. And on the distal radius, pronator quadratus muscle and the tendon of the supinator longus attach to the distal quarter of the radial shaft. That is all about the important features of radius. Now we will talk about the other bone of forearm. The ulna is a long bone found in the forearm that stretches from the elbow above to the wrist bones below. It runs parallel to the radius, which is the other long bone in the forearm. The ulna is the medial bone of the forearm and is homologous with the fibula of the lower limb. Just like the radius, it has a proximal end with 2 processes, a shaft, and a narrow rounded distal end. For convenience, and to make it easier for you to remember and distinguish the 2 bones of forearm, the proximal end will be referred as the upper end and the distal end as the lower end respectively. The upper end is hook-like, with its concavity directed forwards. The lateral border of the shaft is sharp and crest-like. Pointed styloid process lies posteromedial to the rounded head of ulna at its lower end. Let's look at them one by one a bit closely, starting with the upper end. The upper end presents the two process, olecranon and coronoid processes, two notches, the trochlear and radial notches. Olecranon process projects upwards from the shaft. Its anterior surface articulates with the trochlear notch. The posterior surface forms a triangular subcutaneous area that is separated from the skin by a bursa. Coronoid processes. The coronoid process projects forwards from the shaft just below the olecranon process and has four surfaces, namely superior, anterior, medial, and lateral. The superior surface forms the lower part of the trochlear notch. The anterior surface is triangular and rough. Its lower corner forms the ulnar tuberosity. The upper part of its lateral surface is marked by the radial notch for the head of the radius. The annular ligament is attached to the anterior and posterior margins of the notch. The lower part of the lateral surface forms a depressed area to accommodate the radial tuberosity. It is limited behind by a ridge called the supinator crest. The medial surface is continuous with the medial surface of the shaft. Those were the two process, that is, bony projections of the ulnar bone. As for the two notches, the trochlear notch forms an articular surface that articulates with the trochlea of the humerus to form the elbow joint. The radial notch articulates with the head of the radius to form the superior radiulnar joint. Let's look at the shaft of the ulna. The shaft has three borders and three surfaces. Borders. The interosseous or lateral border is the sharpest in its middle 2/4. Inferiorly, it can be traced to the lateral side of the head. Superiorly, it is continuous with the supinator crest. Let's briefly talk about the structure that connects the two bones, other than the articulation points of the bones. A structure known as the interosseous membrane of the forearm connects the two bones as shown here. It is a fibrous sheet that connects the interosseous margins of the radius and the ulna. It is the main part of the radio-ulnar syndesmosis, a fibrous joint between the two bones. The interosseous membrane is designed to shift compressive loads from the distal radius to the proximal ulna. The interosseous membrane is composed of 5 ligaments: central band, accessory band, distal oblique bundle, proximal oblique cord, dorsal oblique accessory cord. The anterior border is thick and rounded. It begins above on the medial side of the ulnar tuberosity, passes backwards in its lower 1/3, and terminates at the medial side of the styloid process. The posterior border is subcutaneous. It begins above at the apex of the triangular subcutaneous area at the back of the olecranon process and terminates at the base of the styloid process. As for the surfaces of the ulnar shaft, the anterior surface lies between the anterior and interosseous borders. A nutrient foramen is seen on the upper part of this surface. It is directed upwards. The nutrient artery is derived from the anterior interosseous artery. The medial surface lies between the anterior and posterior borders. The posterior surface lies between the posterior and interosseous borders. It is subdivided into 3 areas by 2 lines. An oblique line divides it into upper and lower parts. The lower part is further divided by a vertical line into a medial and a lateral area. Now let's look at the lower end of the ulna that forms the wrist joint. The lower end is made up of the head and the styloid process. The head articulates with the ulnar notch of the radius to form the inferior radiulnar joint. It is separated from the wrist joint by the articular disc ulnar artery, and the nerve lies on the anterior aspect of the head of the ulna. The styloid process projects downwards from the posteromedial side of the lower end of the ulna. Posteriorly, between the head and the styloid process, there is a groove for the tendon of the extensor carpi ulnaris. That is all about the bony landmarks of the ulnar bone. Let's jump in and see which muscles are attached to this bone. Muscle attachments are particularly important to support the movement of the forearm. So let's have a look at these. Firstly, if we look at the upper end of the ulna, it has two main portions of muscle attachments. At the olecranon and coronoid process. The olecranon process serves as an attachment site for several muscle groups, including the flexor carpi ulnaris and anconeus. The major muscle attachment is that of the triceps, which is the tricep brachii muscle. At the supinator crest, a part of the supinator muscle originates from here. As for the coronoid process, brachialis inserts to anterior and inferior coronoid process, while the pronator teres originates from the medial surface of it. Flexor digitorum superficialis originates from the medial surface and from the humeral medial epicondyle. Now moving to the shaft of the ulna. Talking about the shaft of ulna, we have flexor digitorum profundus. It arises from the upper 3/4 of the anterior and medial surfaces of the shaft, the medial surfaces of the coronoid and olecranon processes. Another muscle known as pronator quadratus is a square-shaped muscle that originates from the anterior and medial surfaces of the ulna. As for the extensor carpi ulnaris muscle, if you remember, this was the muscle that passes through the ECU groove at the distal part of the ulna. In the medial portion, there are three muscles. Abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis longus, and extensor indicis also originates from interosseous membrane. That is all about the bones of forearm, their bony landmarks, and muscles attachment.
Explore our extensive library of over 1,800 video lectures to learn about a wide range of topics. Only on sqadia.com.